Treasurer Jim Chalmers has accused the coalition of playing divisive politics after it withdrew support for a major shake-up of the Reserve Bank that would have created a new specialist rate-setting board. The RBA review recommended creating a monetary policy board chaired by the Governor and a management board focused on the everyday running of the RBA, including regulating the payment system and printing banknotes. The Treasurer said this morning that he'd met 3 times with the Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor since April 2023, attempting to get bipartisanship support on these reforms.
The Shadow Treasurer raised 6 issues, and I have accommodated his view on every single one of those 6 issues that he has raised.
Mr Taylor wants every RBA board member currently to be placed onto the new monetary policy board to prevent Mr Chalmers from what he calls sacking and stacking the board.
He ignored the recommendations of the review when he made his first 2 appointments on the day the review came out. On the very day the review came out, he ignored the recommendations of the appointment process. He ignored the coalition's feedback when introducing the legislation in November. Our notes and letters went unanswered for the best part of a year.
The Treasurer says he may need to negotiate with the Greens to get this legislation passed.
Well, first of all, on the Greens, the Greens have raised it in the context of other discussions that we've had, over time, but we've not been kind of seriously negotiating with the Greens on it, and that's because I've expressed a view and a preference that this be a bipartisan outcome with the major governing parties. And I think that's in the country's interest. I think it's in the national economic interest that there be bipartisanship between the major parties.
Well, for some analysis on this, I'm joined by Warren Hogan, Chief Economic Advisor for Judo Bank. Warren, thanks for your time. Look, the Greens apparently want the Treasurer to maintain his veto power over the RBA. I mean, that sounds like a reasonable request, right?
Yeah, g'day, Ed. Yeah, no, and I think the coalition wanted that as well, which is pretty much a status quo issue. I think what is more concerning with the Greens, from what we can tell, is their desire to keep an arrangement in place that has been there but never really used in the modern context, and that's that the Reserve Bank Governor can direct banks where to lend in the economy. Now, this is something completely outdated in a market economy, goes back to the pre-deregulation days, but that sort of gives us some insight into a more interventionist approach that the Greens would like to see around the RBA and monetary policy in this country.
Yeah, that thing you're talking about there, they want the RBA to hold on to Section 36 of the Banking Act, which allows them, to direct future monetary stimulus to specific sectors. I mean, in the Greens case, you'd think they'd probably want spending on renewable energy and things like that. So this is something that obviously I don't think the major parties would want the RBA to hold on to.
No, and I'm not sure that it's feasible because the RBA no longer is the regulator of the banks. APRA was stripped out from that function decades ago. And the only way I can see that sort of playing a role is if we have some sort of QE event where the RBA goes and funds through the purchase of securities certain industries. But otherwise, it's just not practical because the RBA doesn't have that oversight of banks that it once had.
Now, this legislation, it was meant to be in place more than a month ago. It's clearly a stalemate right now. But if it does pass and the RBA board does get split in 2, do you think that will improve the Reserve Bank and the way it operates?
Yeah, look, that was the idea from the review. And I think one of the problems we've got right now is this impasse around what that monetary policy setting committee looks like. The spirit of the review was that you're going to bring actually independent experts in. And I think what the opposition Treasurer Angus Taylor is saying is that the government sort of revealed their hand when they appointed 2 unionists to the board straight up, and they don't trust them to actually bring in genuinely independent experts. So that's the problem, and I think it is the right way to go forward. But they do have to be genuinely independent. We cannot have political actors on the RBA Monetary Policy Setting Committee. They need to be people who are from a background in commerce or academia.
Yeah, some things from the review have already taken place. Right now, there are less cash rate meetings each year. There's gone from 11 down to 8. There's also the press conference from the Governor after every meeting. From a media perspective, it's been great. You get a lot more questions with the Governor. But from your point of view as an economist, is it an improvement?
You look, it's hard to say. I mean, it's obviously less often. We've got our own circumstances. This year's been pretty tricky for monetary policy, but I think it's fine. And of course, these are changes that have been able to be made without a change in the RBA Act. I think the key, though, is this: how are we going to go about setting monetary policy? Because what the idea was to bring a bit more expertise in to help support the Reserve Bank in this task. And where we got to now is this sort of typical political process where they want to sort of put in their own people. So, look, I think the overall approach is fine, but we have got to get independent people on that board.
Obviously, there's an election year coming up next year. Do you think this is going to be resolved before the election? Because as you get close to an election, lots of legislation starts dropping out of Parliament, right?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure, but if the Greens are simply looking for those two features of the existing RBA Act to remain in place, and that is it, then I can see how the government will get a deal done with them to get this legislation through. I just don't think that that's all there'll be to it from the Greens. It's still early days, because the noises they've made repeatedly over the last few years is about really bringing into question, a la Donald Trump, the whole independence of the RBA, and that the government should be directing monetary policy, which isn't coming through in the discussions today. So, look, if it's a modest claim just for those two provisions to remain in place, then I think it can get done, and then that the legislation can be passed before the election.
Yeah, I think we're expecting to hear from the Greens at some point this afternoon, just putting their full position out there to the media. But just looking at the Reserve Bank themselves, they've still kept the door open to raising interest rates in our economy. Do you think that's actually going to happen with where things are sitting now?
Well, they don't want to, that's for sure. We know that because any other Reserve Bank board in the last 30 years would have had them higher by now. The governor and this board is giving this economy every chance, but we're just not seeing the inflation go. So, yes, I think they're not saying this lightly. In fact, the governor's being so strong on this because she knows how close we are to needing higher interest rates if we want to get inflation down. So I've still got a rate hike in for November.
You do?
The
Okay.
simple fact is,
You've still got a rate hike going for September, or November.
But for November, yeah. And look, it's a line ball call, and the data in the next 2 months is going to be critical. But in the end, it's that October CPI. RBA needs a big step down in CPI. It's not clear that that's happening. So that's why she's keeping the door open, because it's a very
Warren,
possible thing
thank
that could
you.
happen.
We're out of time.